Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Mann. I'm the city manager here in Yucaipa. Thank you so much for coming tonight for what will be the first of two community meetings on the Wine Country Specific Plan. For those of you who are not familiar, this has been a concept that has been discussed and has been in process for about 5 years now. It's been a very in-depth process. As probably most of the people in the room know, as it turns out, areas of this region, including the northern North Bench area of Yucaipa, Oak Glen, parts of Calimesa, have climates that are very conducive to the growing of wine grapes. And when this became evident, there became kind of a growing wine community in the region that said, you know what, maybe we should make this a real thing and apply for an American viticultural, to be an American viticulture area. So back in 2018, the city joined with that group and supported that effort. And then the discussions were had, well, okay, if this is to be an AVA, how do we foster, or should we, the concept of really creating a real wine region here in Yucaipa? And so that was the beginning of kind of a long process. There was a committee, a citizen committee that met over many months to talk about the concept and how it should be approached, if it should be approached. Following that process, we began the environmental work. So that's been going on for over a year now with our consultant PlaceWorks. And where we are today is that environmental work has reached the tail end of that process. And we have released what is called an environmental impact report, or an EIR, that talks about all of the impacts that something like this would have on the community. And that report is now publicly available and is circulating. We'll encourage you to take a look at that. The purpose of this meeting today is to talk about, in part, that report. And the second meeting we have will be a time to come back after having, listened to the presentation today and the discussion today. If you are interested in really digging in and looking at that EIR, to give everyone time to do that. And then we'll come back and have another meeting where we can really dig into any questions or concerns that people have based on everything they've heard about the concept up to now. So our Deputy Director of Development Services, Ben Matlock, will lead us through a presentation here that talks about the whole history of this concept, how we got to where we are today, talk about the EIR, talk about giving us some pointers on how to read an EIR and kind of the key things to look for in an EIR. It's a pretty thick document, but he's got some shortcuts for us that make it a little bit easier to digest. And then we will take some questions and answers with the idea that what we're looking for is questions if you have, if you need clarification on any of the details. What's really not so helpful today is just expressions of opinion on whether or not you like the concept. There will be time for that, plenty of time for that. But the phase we're in right now is let's just all understand what this concept is. What is it exactly that's being proposed? And we'll have the second meeting and we'll further flesh that out. At this time, we anticipate the timeline from there will be a Planning Commission hearing sometime in either January or February, and then a City Council final decision in February or March of next year. So we want to make sure that, this is a big decision for this community. It signifies a shift in direction for a segment of our community. And so the City Council and staff want to make sure that we get a lot of community input, that people understand what really is being proposed, so that when we get to the City Council gets educated feedback from the public on whether this is something that people are interested in or not. So with that, I'll hand it off to Ben, and we'll jump right into the presentation. Thank you.
All right. All right, thank you. Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone, to the Yucaipa Performing Arts Center. If it's your first time, enjoy it. It is a beautiful venue, but I'm happy to have you guys here tonight to kind of talk about the Wine Country Specific Plan, kind of why it is been designed the way it is, the feedback, the process that helped get us to here tonight, and kind of why it's designed like it is. Oops. All right, so kind of the background, this idea of a wine country actually really kind of started as a grassroots initiative. So the city of Yucaipa didn't think, hey, let's go plant grapes, but really there were residents in our community that were enthusiasts. They liked to do wine tasting events. They would host, weekly dinners or whatever the case may be, and really just kind of enjoyed all aspects of, the wine production. From there, a number of those different individuals kind of started going into amateur winemaking. And so you had different just residents of Yucaipa start going, okay, how do we make wine? How do we enhance our appreciation for wine? And then from there, it kind of enhanced further from, okay, how do we have this hobby to how do we actually make it kind of a business in the community? And so kind of, you have over a course of 2 different decades, these hobbyists, and then ultimately in 2013, Suved Cellars opened their door as a commercial wine venture in the city of Yucaipa, making wines from there. And then from there, that has expanded to other local wineries, and then the Wine Alliance forming in 2015 that further has added areas under vine in the city, helped others kind of learn how about the winemaking process, and kind of built this idea of, okay, what does this go into and how can we make a lasting impression with the city of Yucaipa? And then certainly that industry has been growing with success. We do have, let's say, for example, this photos of Yucaipa, the Uptown Wine Merchant, where they have a showcase of locally made wines from Yucaipa and Redlands. And so there are people that are kind of doing this at a commercial level. And then we do have Suved Cellars and North Cork Winery in the city kind of area as well. And then certainly one of the benefits that we have seen is these kind of local wine makers, Herman York and Redlands, Suved Cellars, all are kind of making award-winning wine. So not only are they making kind of Yucaipa stuff, but they're also doing it in a kind of a fashion that's been pretty successful, won a lot of accolades. And so really from there, they're kind of going, okay, hey, this is helping out. And then certainly the growth of like Suved Cellars in the Uptown District and those kind of related activities have added economic development and vibrancy to areas like the Uptown and other parts of the community. Now, all this kind of interest kind of kept growing and ultimately resulted in kind of the idea of, okay, if we get good local grapes, for our local wines, rather than just making wine from Lodi or Paso Robles, it would be nice as a Yucaipa wine maker to have a Yucaipa branded kind of wine, stuff that was from the town itself. And so that's where that interest came from with the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance, and they were formed in 2015. As part of that alliance, they did kind of a market analysis as well as some geotechnical work and really kind of looked at, hey, could we provide good grapes here? They started building kind of small planted vines in areas, and then they formed fundraised and eventually submitted a petition to the federal government to establish the Yucaipa Valley American Viticultural Area, or AVA. And so this encompasses the city of Yucaipa, parts of Calamasa, parts of unincorporated San Bernardino County as well, but really kind of saying, okay, at federal government, we have good conditions for growing grapes. We have some local winemakers, some local wineries and kind of vineyards happening, and this thing should kind of build up. And so they did the fundraising for that. This is a gala that was held at the Yucaipa Performing Arts Center that was, I think, very highly attended as well, where they announced officially that the AVA petition was deemed as perfected and it was going through the formal review. So the federal government saw, hey, this does kind of meet the things that we need to look at, and so they started that review process as well. Meanwhile, this new kind of budding industry was also involved quite a bit in kind of different community functions. And so the Yucaipa Valley Wine Alliance in, I believe, 2018, held kind of the California, or 2019, held the California Night. So it was a market night kind of festival in the Uptown with jazz, music, and they were doing fundraising for their AVA petition. The Suved Sellers, for example, held events with other local businesses where they partner up and kind of help kind of share that passion that they have. And then certainly other organizations also participated with different nonprofits in the community, and really just trying to help leverage of these are ultimately kind of local businesses trying to help out the local community. And so from there, it started asking, well, how do we create the wineries in place? They had approached the city and certainly been trying to advocate for planting of vineyards in different spots, and we've certainly seen a growth of that. And kind of the challenge that Yucaipa has is we're not a wine industry-based place. When you look at places like Napa or Sonoma, they were growing grapes prior to Prohibition. And so they had this legacy kind of infrastructure. And so while the Wine Alliance has been growing stuff, it's still kind of, at its infancy in terms of the infrastructure needed. And really, part of it is investment, making, once you plant the grapes, it isn't like you have wine the next year. It does take a process to grow the grapes, get them to maturity, and then go through the wine-making process. And so there is a investment that's needed to do it. And then kind of the last component, after you kind of get the industry in place, is there isn't agricultural zoning in the city of Yucaipa. There's no spot in the city that says this is meant for farms only. You can do this and no other use is allowed. It's all set up for something else. And so really, our governmental rules, our zoning code is in the way of facilitating this industry that was being proposed and gaining support through the efforts of that group. And then certainly you can't just say, hey, we have an ad zoning. You actually have to have vacant land to plant the grapes as part of it. And so really kind of looking at our zoning code doesn't have the same. At the same time, though, there's an AVA petition and kind of this growing support to further encourage kind of local wine industry. And so we have this kind of growing industry happening here, but really no mechanism in place on the city's end to help either foster it or to help kind of navigate through it either. And so kind of this whole wine country specific plan effort really kind of started off with just a research phase. And so we had a workshop in Temecula that a number of people attended, and there were a few kind of key lessons that we learned. One is that we are kind of ahead of the curve. Some of these places where they did have industry in place, or let's say like Temecula, where they had it and then really the economic development kind of ramped up later on, is that created some conflicts where they're kind of reacting through the entire process with what the industry is doing, trying to help leverage it in the sense that they can, but also they were dealing with legacy issues. And so Temecula really iterated that. We were kind of on a path of looking at it proactively, saying, okay, if this does happen, let's try and make it in a way that makes sense. But we can also address maybe some of the pitfalls that they learned through reacting through that process. And then also really was trying to think about the setting of where this wine industry, if you're going to have tasting rooms, and kind of supporting that. So if you have this kind of, existing kind of neighborhood and then this winery kind of places in there and is going to have some events or something like that, that can create conflicts. And so we really had to look at it and go, okay, how do we not create conflict between neighbors and look at it in a more comprehensive component? And then another component is that it is a dynamic industry. It is a business. It is farming. Farming is always variable every year. It's based on how the market is. And so having that flexibility to react to where that market goes and kind of what products are more commercially viable and which are not certainly is helpful as well. If the government regulations are too constrained, then those industries usually end up kind of fighting with that as well. And so that was something that other different wine areas as well have kind of run into looking at it. And then certainly one component that did come out with that workshop in Temecula is it has created a lot of economic development for that community. They've done very financially well as a result of that. Wineries themselves isn't just making the grapes, but there's all these other industries that build up from it, from restaurants that cater to people visiting, the hotels that get more patrons visiting as well, but then also just some of the setting. You get kind of the small business, where you have a photographer taking photos for people's weddings and other stuff that all kind of comes about. And so Temecula did highlight that that was one other kind of additional feature. You have all these other sub-businesses, other local activities happen as a result of kind of this broader industry that's in place. So really kind of looking at then from the lessons from Temecula, figuring out what direction we needed to go and kind of going from that exploration into kind of the next stage. So certainly, key thing, in order to have a wine industry, you have to have grapes, you have to have space for vineyards. And you need grapes, need space. We can't just try and tuck them into, hey, I have some area in my backyard, I'm going to create a wine industry. That wasn't the way that that industry really makes a commercially viable operation. Is we need a little bit more land, and then kind of looking at areas of the city that does have vacant land. So certainly, where is a blank slate of vacant land? The city, through our public outreach kind of component and committee, looked at areas, the North Bench being the largest area, and then the freeway corridor being the other one. As part of the analysis, North Bench does have good soil composition, does have south-facing slopes, and does have high diurnal temperature variation, which means that the hot days, the cold nights are something that helps the grapes do well. And as they say, happy grapes make happy wine, kind of, in California. Oh, wait, I think that's for cows, but still. That is something as part of the North Bench that they did look at and really kind of found, okay, there's an area to do something special with this land. So this is kind of an aerial kind of showing the plan area as kind of the majority of the vacant land with neighborhoods along the far kind of west end, and then the El Dorado Park and Five Winds Ranch to the east of it, and then kind of north of Oakland Road. And so this was kind of the largest area of kind of unused land where if we wanted to do something different to help support an industry, this would be a spot that could be suitable for doing it. Now, one of the challenges with this project or kind of this assessment is the reality of us living in California. So why do we have to talk about housing in the first place? Well, two reasons. One is we are in the state of California, and then the other one is kind of the existing rights. So long story short, we've had some presentations with City Council, as well as a Plan Commission on kind of the housing laws that are in place. But really, the idea is with state law, one law in particular, SB 330, really says, hey, if you have a zone capacity, so the city, if you take the number of how many units are allowed to build there based on the density times the area, the city cannot remove that housing capacity without placing it elsewhere. And so really then the question becomes, and I do want to preface this as well, the law itself doesn't think what we think could be built there. It is purely just a mathematical, if you have so many acres, you're allowed to build so many houses on this. It's a straight cut of number of the zone capacity. It isn't us able to subtract out land of what we think may not be as feasible. So the state law really is saying if you're allowed to build 1,000 units, you're allowed to build 1,000 units. And so if you remove that, you have to place it elsewhere. And so some of the challenges that we did look at, and one of the things we did explore was, okay, maybe we rezone other parts of the community to make up for that shortfall. And certainly one of the challenges is when you're looking at a large area like the North Bench, is that's a lot of units that get added on top of what's already allowed in other parts of the city. And so you kind of look at it, we did outreach, and residents didn't necessarily want to add 1,000 units to, let's say, the Dunlap Acres area so that no housing was built in the North Bench or something like that. And so really then it was kind of, okay, looking at that, and then another component is if we're changing that, we're trading kind of the high-income housing stock of single-family houses. If we transfer it to places like Dunlap Acres, it's going to be apartments, so we're trading high-income households for low-income households, and then also adding a lot more housing capacity for it in order to comply with state law. And so that's part of it. And then another component is, at the end of the day, people do own the vacant land in the North Bench. They do have certain, property rights in place as part of that. And so when we did surveys, as part of the efforts, one of the number one responses we got was, we need to protect existing property owner rights. And so if they're allowed to build housing on that property, then as part of maintaining that rights is developing a way that makes sense for that. So they're allowed to do it. We can't just say you can't build anything on your property without taking those landowner rights away. Now, one of the difficult discussions that through kind of the process that everyone kind of looked at is what is rural in its truest sense. And so we all collectively have an idea of what it means to us. We all have an idea of, Yucaipa is a rural community, and we have certain impressions of what it is. It does vary depending on what it is. What one person views as a rural concept is different than another. It isn't a defined, this is the component that meets that. There isn't an objective standard in the City of Yucaipa's general plan or zoning code that says this is the component that is strictly what rural is, and this is the standard that does it. And the reality is lot sizes don't necessarily dictate rural. There are properties in the City of Yucaipa that have smaller lots that feel more rural than some of those with large lots, and it's a much bigger impression of just a number and a density that creates that impression. And so through that, there was a planning committee formed, and they really did look at and kind of survey, what are these impressions that we associate with being rural. And so it's the green space areas, open space, features that don't see as built out where you have, a very defined front yard, you have all these components to it. Quality landscaping as well. The nighttime sky ordinance is a big thing as well. You want to be able to have not the city lights glaring at you as part of that rural thing. Some of the kind of agrarian activities with farming activities, and then certainly the rustic elements. It's all this broader impression of space and how you interact with it that creates kind of the rural impression. Now, one of the challenges that we do have as well that's going to kind of pop up is not only has the North Bench is zoned right now RL1. There's been a number of different maps that have been approved in the past or are still active for that area. And so one of the challenges when we kind of look at it and distill it just from outside of, hey, this is a 1 acre subdivision, is, a lot of these projects were designed, you have backyards that back up directly to the public streets. The area itself is subject to what's known as the Custom Home Overlay District. But there really isn't any objective kind of standards other than just setbacks, the garage placement, and then the unit size as part of it. We even have manufactured homes that have been built in the Custom Home Overlay District that meet all the set standards that we could actually legally enforce with it. And there really isn't actually anything in place specifically for good design in that. And then certainly with the different projects, there isn't necessarily a very coordinated effort for trails. There really isn't any dedicated areas of open space. And then I do want to also note, when these projects that all pass through, there wasn't necessarily community support for it saying, hey, this is a 1 acre subdivision. We are so excited that this is coming to town. It was filled with people that were highly against these projects for the reasons kind of specified. They were not happy. People did specify kind of after that decision was made that they were not happy with it. And then also when they were approved, they met the requirements, and so that's what it was. And that ultimately is what has been allowed in it, and they can certainly continue that way. But really kind of the effort was we take something that looks like this and then kind of transform it into, maybe something where we have our public streets not facing backyards of houses. How can we create a designated open space area consistent with state law that provides that kind of green belt that we want to see in our community? And how do we kind of minimize the appearance of these kind of built out subdivisions that would have been allowed already? Now, as part of kind of the planning around this, a few different things were kind of set up. So we have in the wine country specific plan 2 different housing districts. The first one is the estates, which are half-acre lots. I do want to kind of show, and it should pop up. These are adjacent to existing half-acre neighborhoods. And so part of it was we have these existing neighborhoods in place. As we transition to wine growing areas or wineries, is how do we minimize some of the input or impact to those existing neighborhoods? And so a lot of the development around existing homes is all set up to kind of tie in with those existing neighborhoods and kind of provide an extension of those existing neighborhood feel. The only exception really is where Creekside Drive is, and then also Country Lane, where they do have a little bit larger lots. Certainly some of those neighborhoods are built out where they do have a number of large, like ADUs and other secondary structures on it that have been built out, and so really the transition is a little bit more mitigated kind of through that process. But this was where the design was laid out. But one of the other components that was explored, we do have a second district called the Villas, which are 10,000 square foot lots. Now, one of the things that was prioritized is this area was where open space was already provided, or where open space is already kind of located. And so the idea was we don't want to develop that open space. We don't want backyards in that open space. But we want to make sure we have enough space for allowing kind of that green belt of wineries around it. And so the villas itself, these kind of smaller lots, are insulated from any existing neighborhood in the city of Yucaipa. And so unless you're driving to that neighborhood, you're not in that neighborhood. You're not seeing the difference between what your house is on Fremont Street to what's happening here. And then also one of the things is that the setbacks and using the wineries is it does place it a little bit further out of sight. Now, one of the things that kind of talking about the existing kind of approved subdivisions and kind of what, if someone were to build what's already approved, one of the things that we kind of look at, one of our scenic corridors is Oakland Road. This right here is kind of the current approved project where we'd have backyards kind of along Oakland Road. And this is kind of an idea with, once you kind of put the houses there, when you're driving along Oakland Road, this is what is allowed to be built and consistent with it. And then also, this doesn't consider with it that someone could build an ADU closer to the rear property line along that scenic corridor, or other laws that have come into effect like SB 9 that a homeowner could also leverage as well. Whereas kind of the wine country, the effort with it was to prioritize keeping kind of Oakland Road as a scenic corridor, having that your view shed from Oakland Road and how the topography changes would all be grapes and the olive grove instead, and you want to have houses along that street corridor. Now, I do want to kind of cover as well, since I have to administer the development code, what does the RL1 and Custom Home Overlay District, the existing rules, have in place? Well, it says 1 acre gross is the RL1 district. You have to have a 2,200 square foot home with a 3-car garage, 20-foot side yard setback, 40-foot front yard, and then you have to have a design consistent with its architecture style. With current state law, that definition doesn't mean anything. It isn't something that I could reasonably enforce on a plan check for a house, because what does reasonably consistent mean? There's no objective standard that says if you're building a Craftsman house, this is the element you have to do. It just says you have to meet some sort of style, but there's no teeth to what the city has to do it. And then there's also a specification for a minimum number of floor plans. And that's all that the standards are in place under the existing zoning. And then one of the kind of challenges as we kind of look at what is in place, most of our nicer custom home neighborhoods in the city of Yucaipa predate this stuff. They have smaller yards. They're maybe 20,000 square feet, or they may have different setbacks that were set from the original subdivision map that predates the custom home overlay district. And so the idea of some of our most beautiful neighborhoods that we have in the city of Yucaipa aren't something that follows these particular rules. They have a different set of rules that are more kind of forgiving than what is currently in place, but more enforceable from what they were done at that time. And so we don't have the teeth to replicate some of our cherished neighborhoods in the city just by adhering to this code requirement right now. And so kind kind of looking at the rural standards beyond just, hey, okay, we have this existing RL1, was kind of looking at with the wine country efforts, in addition to the location of housing and the use of the wineries along the periphery and making sure that those are the focal point with it, is also having kind of modified standards that really do augment kind of that rustic nature. And so there is, as part of the requirements, a 100-foot separation between any neighborhood and the winery, so you have opportunities for trails to go between it, decorative trees, maybe some of the cedar trees to go through, and making sure that that landscape and trail access is available to all residents of Yucaipa. And then really leveraging the wineries along the key roadways. So Jefferson and Oakland Road, for example, wouldn't have houses and backyards to it. It'd be wineries and grapes instead. As part of it, there is additional setbacks for the winery buildings. And so when we looked at Oakland Road and seeing the yards based on what is designed on those subdivisions, the setback for where a wine building would need to be from Oakland Road is a lot higher than what is currently allowed under the existing kind of layout. And then another component that was very important is we want to make sure that these wineries develop and that they are indeed growing and producing wine. And so there is a requirement that any kind of winery that gets established that has a building or, let's say, tasting room, that 75% of the property has to be actually used as agriculture. So it isn't someone just planting 2 grapes and saying, hey, I'm a winery and I'm going to have this big event center. No, it's this property is going to be, first and foremost, a vineyard, and then the winery use is kind of allowed once they meet that requirement. And then another component with the rural standards is the way that the plan is written has a number of kind of the night sky ordinance stuff too, specifying the color and temperature of light, making sure that's not directed up, with very objective set regulations that if someone is out of compliance, we can go check and make sure that they're not blinding or glaring up into the night sky as well. And then certainly one of the other components with the plan is creating some of the most rigorous standards or the most rigorous standards for how development should be, especially for residential development in the city. So it really is taking what would be just, hey, you have to have 2,200 square feet and a 3-car garage, but really specific standards that if someone's going to build a project, we will be checking the box, did you meet this or not? And they have to be upheld to that. It does define distinct architectural styles in that plan as well, while maintaining the variation and the size requirements of the custom home overlay district. So the things that we could enforce today is maintained, but augmented considerably with that layout. And then really leveraging with it is the idea of a 50-50 split. So any person that owns a property in the wine country plan area, at least half the property is not going to be a housing development project. That was one of the key things is we want the vines, we want open space, we do not want the property to be mostly houses. It is a 50-50 split. It needs to be less houses and more other stuff that through the outreach efforts was deemed as a more benefit. And that's not something that happens very often. Most developers want to build kind of everything that they can with it. And then another kind of component that I think is part of that rural standard is really having impervious parking, really kind of leveraging when you have a wine tasting spot, it doesn't feel heavily commercial, but much more kind of down to earth, a lot more low key. When you kind of compare different wine regions, I'm sure most of us are familiar with Temecula. It's a very high production type of area, a lot of commercial traffic. Most wine regions are not quite set up that way, and so really the idea was we don't want to be a Temecula 2.0 in terms of how we're laid out. We want to be much more quaint, and there's a lot of good examples that we look to as part of that effort. And then certainly the last kind of component with the effort is the winery. So recognizing that it is a dynamic type of industry, there was a recommendation for 3 kind of scale of wineries going from micro of 2.5 acres minimum to at least 10 acres for the boutique. And really it's to allow flexibility that if you have a piece of land, you want to set it up, you can kind of tailor the size to what kind of market you want to do, and allowing that flexibility for investment and the entrepreneurialism to get into that industry, or as those winemakers kind of grow. And also kind of looking at market trends. So one of the things when we look at, let's say, the micro winery, is looking at other industries like the wine region of Napa, where a lot of these smaller winemakers want to be able to still be successful with it. They don't want to be, some of these larger scale, Sutter Home type of ventures. They want to be more boutique. They want to be low scale, quality over quantity. And that has been a big push in those type of wine regions to allow that flexibility. And so using that as a case study of why the committee ultimately kind of supported this range of uses, and then really kind of allowing, if you have much more property under vine, then you can do more activity as well. And then one of the key themes that had been part of our discussions with it was the Casablanca Ranch that is in the specific plan area is hopefully allowing the vessel for that to be used, be a public amenity for the community, be able to kind of re-energize itself as kind of the old ranch that it was, and allowing the ability for that to actually capture the revenue potential it would need to maintain the ongoing needs of that building. And so it is a very old building, and takes some effort to revive, restore, and so we want to make sure that if someone is going to go through that effort, that there's a mechanism in place that it's not a wasted effort or a kind of money pit for that, but really making sure that the long-term use can be leveraged. Now, one thing I do want to kind of cover is that in the wine country specific plan that is available on the city's website in its entirety, along with environmental documents, it is including an assessment of its consistency with the city's general plan. And so these are some of the different policies that the specific plan is consistent with the city's existing general plan, as well as this list as well. This one here, and this one here. So as part of the analysis, it is listed in the specific plan, and so there is a discussion for it, but as part of the city's general plan, there's a lot of policies about creating unique places, providing opportunities to maintain a rural sense of appearance, providing opportunities for economic development, and providing just really kind of a broad range of activities and recreational amenities for the city residents as well. And so these policies reflect kind of the gamut of what the specific plan is able to achieve. Now, a big part of this effort wasn't something that that one person or one group or any kind of particular thing dominated. It really was kind of assessed through a planning committee made up of a lot of different people, including the decision makers, which is the city council, the plan commissioners, which would probably be dealing with a lot of the land use kind of questions and their expertise, trails and open space, economic development, the Wine Alliance as well, since that vision of creating a wine industry spurred from that dream itself. A landowner representative, since we're telling what people should be able to do on their property, and then kind of 3 at-large community members. And so the first phase of that project was really looking at kind of the background, what do we have, what are our opportunities and constraints, and kind of assessing from there. And so this is kind of a list of the members that were part of that phase 1 kind of research phase. And then we went into phase 2, which was the development of the actual tool that ended up becoming the wine country specific plan. And then these are the members that are part of it. A number of the members are continuation from it. So we do have a council member that was in both phases. Trails and Open Space and Economic Development Committee member that was also in both phases. We had a plan commissioner that was, as part of phase 1, that was no longer a plan commissioner, but also participated in phase 2. And then one of the member at large members was also through both phases. And so there was some people that had kind of through the background of all the effort, but then also new perspectives kind of carry through as well, and then kind of assess that effort. Now, the plan committee itself, I'll kind of say, really was to work through a lot of different interests. When we're looking at how the city should grow or what type of industry should be in the city, there isn't one group that has the ruling right over everyone else of what we should do in our community. But really, there's a lot of perspectives. We have over 55,000 people in our city. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were getting a broad brush of different interests, different backgrounds to help kind of lead us there. And really was to review and make recommendations under the spirit of consensus. So when we look at this type of activity, when you're kind of saying, hey, how should the city look in 10 years? You're not going to get the same result from every person. If you ask everyone, they're going to have a different answer. And so there's no way we can assess things through complete unanimous support, but really just going, okay, what are the things that we have common ground on? Where do we not, and where do we need to modify to get there? And then really with the different community members is, as they're part of those different organizations that they represent, is they're taking that feedback back to those groups and saying, hey, this is kind of where we're at. This is kind of where our interest is being supported, or maybe not as well as we want to. What should we do? And that was kind of the way it was supposed to be tied up. Really was leveraging one, we had to have decision makers kind of with it, since they would be the ones that ultimately have to make that decision. We wanted to have an expert with the Wine Alliance in place just because this is part of, again, the dream that they brought to, they had grown that grassroots initiative, and so want to make sure that we had that feedback. Kind of looking at the business and economic development perspective is if we set something up where no one could ever do it and it falls flat on the face, then that's where a policy has failed, because policy should be able to do something in some sort of positive regard. If it doesn't do anything, if it's ineffective because we made it in a way that is completely immovable, then it's not going to work and it's a bad policy. Also maintain that community-wide perspective, and then certainly that property owner involvement. These people do own property up there. It isn't necessarily vacant land that has no ownership stake, but someone does own it, and so if we're going to tell them what they can do, we want to make sure that at least they know what it is and have some skin in the game as well on what that could be, or what is kind of immovable as well. Now, through the process, the city did embark on a number of kind of outreach activities, including, we were at city events doing, posters. We had a booth at the middle of the roundabout saying, hey, we're talking about this, provide us feedback, fill out. And so people were providing, input on what they wanted to see, things that they didn't want to see, and that was trying to carry through. We did also have community-wide surveys. Surveys are always tough because we could talk about the statistical kind of probability of how they are, but the result from the surveys that we had, which were kind of the largest participation we had of any surveys that we had done before, really was that this was a cool idea and that the city should try to help make it be successful. And that ultimately guided that approach too. Our planning committee meetings were also open to the public, also during kind of COVID, also on Zoom with links, so they were streaming through that process as well, to kind of get different input, and certainly, brought out some very vibrant discussions as we worked through different issues. We also had a email distribution list, so every time we had a agenda, minutes, presentation, those were all made available to anyone that had expressed interest at the different festivals or at the different meetings as well. We did conduct a number of stakeholder interviews of different people in the community, but also of the industry outside, people that run wineries of different sizes, that deal with kind of that use and try to understand what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, so that we can create good policy. And then really was using that multi-phased approach. So we didn't know what the answer was going to be when we started. And really trying to go, okay, where do we have opportunity? Where do we have constraints? And how do we meet in a way that makes sense, at least in the middle of what we can, based on that input? And then certainly, this thing has certainly generated interest kind of throughout the process. Certainly, this is a clipping from the SoCal News Group that publishes, I think, throughout the entire state of California. So I knew someone from Sacramento that said, hey, this is what you guys are doing in Yucaipa. And so there was kind of this larger recognition of these efforts, but also kind of throughout the process as it went to city council for different kind of elements. The News Mirror also published kind of what that meeting was like as well. We also did include press releases of the process through the City of Yucaipa that also got published in the News Mirror as well. Now, I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a step back. So, kind of brief history. This kind of came to the city through the dream of, community members that wanted to see an industry come through, going from a hobby of making wine to actually doing it on a commercial scale and bringing it there. And then the city council kind of through the process, through different councils, over the course of 16 different meetings, and I think 3 different prior councils that had been in place, have discussed kind of this dream and kind of moved it along to where we are today. So kind of the first step was, as the Wine Alliance was building support, they requested a community activity grant in 2018 that was approved with it. And then there was a presentation that was done as a special presentation in 2018 in September with all the council members talking about, hey, this is what we're working on. This is what the results are of our kind of efforts working through the geotechnical. They had Laura Geotechnical help do, some of the work and figure out, the climate that Yucaipa has for this industry. And then as part of the goals and objectives process in 2019, the city council said, hey, this kind of movement is happening. We need to understand how it impacts our community, how we can make it work in a way that doesn't disrupt the community. And this is really kind of where this activity on the city's end really kind of ramped up from there. And then there was a MOU with the Wine Alliance to do the Summer Gala to help support those kind of initiatives, and really just kind of help facilitate, okay, if you guys are doing the fundraising, we'll make sure that, we're supportive of kind of that process and kind of where that ends up going. And then from there, the city council, as the AVA petition was initiated, did execute kind of the phase 1 process in September of 2019. And that coincided with that workshop I referenced earlier to Temecula. So it was, okay, hey, we're embarking on learning about this. We're going to start doing the deep dive, but we also want to be able to ask questions. And so there were community members from a lot of different organizations that participated in that workshop tour to really kind of ask questions of what works, what doesn't work, and what was, kind of the lessons learned that led to kind of the summary I provided before. And then with that, after the phase 1 project kicked off in that workshop is when the planning committee was started in 2019. And then the membership was kind of confirmed in November of that same year. So the first phase was kind of the assessment. I have a picture of kind of the viticultural operations and associated development standards study. It's quite a mouthful, not necessarily the most marketing-driven name, but certainly was kind of more of a technical document of here's different ways we can go, here's different wine regions and how they've kind of materialized. And from there was a phase 1 recommendation, which is we should probably do something a little bit more, we don't want to go too heavy-handed where the free market can't really kind of do its thing, but we also don't want to let it be so unfettered that we kind of create problems from the start and conflict with that. And so that was reviewed by the city council in January of 2021. And ultimately, city council found that master planned approach, or kind of taking a more proactive way of kind of balancing and addressing some of the conflicts that could happen at the start, was the appropriate way to go. And then the phase 2, which was the development of the actual master plan, began with the award of contract in February of 2021. Now, certainly, this whole effort, it isn't necessarily an easy discussion. It's a very complex discussion. There's a lot of different perspectives, and so council did want to kind of revisit kind of the direction and kind of make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward, and so that was represented on May of 2021. And ultimately, the city council said, no, this is the right way. Looking at kind of the project, so the subdivision that I showed, some of the different maps that have been approved, is having that in place, those getting built, isn't going to give a rural appearance. It's not going to meet, I think, what we would hope for that area. Was the general consensus of that is, okay, we have an opportunity to do something different with it and go from there. And then certainly confirm the membership for phase 2 in June 28th of 2021. and then really kind of embarked on, okay, if we're going to go through this, if we want to encourage this industry in some fashion or another, the Associated Standards or Viticultural Operation Associated Development Standard Study is not a very fun name for that, and so they did name the wine country, Yucaipa Valley Wine Country, as kind of the marketing name, how we should kind of reference it, just because it's a lot easier to say. Or if you say the AVA, that's a federal term, it's not a city land use thing, and so we want to make sure that the name kind of reflected what the endeavor was and not muddle the waters with either a really kind of technical planning nerd name or something that kind of reflects a much broader federal designation than from what the city was doing. And then as part of it, kind of the direction and kind of the land use sides of that was presented in December of 2021 with a concurrence to finalize the draft of the wine country specific plan, and then ultimately begin the environmental review process for that. So again, this was through kind of 3 distinct and separate city councils, so in the course of a number of years, 16 different meetings that ultimately continued the support for this overall direction. Now, when it comes to land use and kind of the different perspectives is, you know, who won in kind of the stakeholder with the different people. And the reality is most people would say no. The Wine Alliance would love to have a lot more vineyards and as much land under vine as they possibly could. As I kind of referenced, developers usually want to build kind of every inch that they can. They want to maximize that, and so when developers have talked about developing pieces of land before, they look at what can I build, how can I build every kind of inch, and can I build more units than what would be allowed now, and kind of building that. And so that's usually a perspective that's there. Certainly, you know, people are used to this being vacant land, want to make sure that there's trails and open space, and would certainly love to have more land kind of unencumbered by anything on it. And then there are certainly those that just want 1 acre lots or no development in general. So this plan itself really is kind of the reflection of a lot of different interests, kind of working through the different perspectives and trying to find ultimately a compromise to help achieve kind of the different visions. So certainly the plan, since we don't have ag zoning in the city, it creates a zone district for agricultural land and provides the encouragement, but the requirements to have land actually be under ag use and preserved ultimately through easement. So if someone builds a winery and saying, hey, this is the land I'm not going to build houses on, they can't turn around the next day and say, oh no, I do want to build houses on it. No, it's now preserved through a conservation easement. That is something that they cannot remove on that. So they are committing themselves to that requirement, which would not be the case otherwise. Developers don't get more lots. They're not allowed to build any more houses than what the zone capacity is. But the marketability of those lots are improved. And so there's kind of that incentive for kind of providing that open space and green space instead. They don't get more lots, but it's a little bit better than what they had before. And open space would be preserved. In the subdivision I kind of showed, Wilson Creek isn't a open space district. It's in the backyard of future people's houses. And so this would be an actual zone where there's going to be open space and perpetuity as well. And then again, the number of housing units remain the same, but really with a much more comprehensive approach and look at the standards in place and saying, okay, the RL district, the custom home overlay district, doesn't really assure a kind of rural nature, but we can provide standards that do instead, and kind of building it from there. And then certainly, where does the city kind of fit in on it? So as I referenced, it does have kind of 30 different policies in the general plan that is consistent with the approach of this specific land. Certainly economic development, you know, you can build houses on that now, on that land, but now we're kind of looking at a broader industry of commercial uses that could be allowed, the industry, you know, the small businesses that form as a result of that as well. Adding sales tax to the city and the transit occupancy tax for people that want to come and visit Yucaipa. And then certainly the indirect support. So if people go out for wine tasting during the day, you know, maybe they'll want to go to a nice dinner in Uptown afterwards or go see a show. It can be part of a a much greater kind of, activity or weekend for those people. And then another component is really we get to hedge against some of the state laws that happen. So one of the things, and I think it's a very tough challenge to recognize, is the state law landscape for housing has changed a lot. So cities really aren't able to say no to stuff if it meets the stuff. So as I talked about, the 1 acre subdivision that is approved can be built. The city couldn't deny that project if it came back through tomorrow. It would be approved for consistency with that. But with it is those yards that are available that front, let's say, Oakland Road, they could build an accessory dwelling unit 4 feet from the side and rear property lines. Or a resident that owns one of those lots could do what's known as SB9 urban lots, but they could subdivide that lot further, build another house on that second lot and an ADU on that. So you go from the idea or the mantra of 1 house, 1 acre, to now you can build a lot more on that just by virtue of what state law is. The idea of that notion is not consistent with state law, and that is the truth. That is the reality. As tough as it may be, it is the reality of the law of what is in place. And so looking at it is, okay, well, we don't want to see houses on the backyard along Oakland Road, or we don't want to have the space where people can do this SB9 split. Can design standards where that really is very difficult to do or impossible. And so it's looking at that proactively. And I will kind of say, as I'm doing the presentation, I would like to see, as people make gestures, that it is in respectful fashion with that, just because we are trying to provide information tonight for everyone. And then kind of, so where are we at tonight with it? So we are kicking off the environmental review phase of what the specific plan is proposing with it. And so it is known as CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. Really, this process at the high level is to just inform decision makers and the public of the possible environmental impacts and effects of a project on the environment. Its analysis includes elements that can help solve environmental impacts if possible, but it doesn't necessarily allow or doesn't necessarily prohibit projects that do impacts. It really is just a way to disclose, hey, if you are making a decision, here's what the impacts are on the environment with it. Other, discussions or, the will of the people or the what the design looks like that isn't necessarily what CEQA is covering, but just really what is going to happen with the impact. Now, CEQA isn't itself an advocate for or against a project, or the project itself is just the analysis of it. It isn't a chance to fix existing problems, so there are Supreme Court rulings that kind of deal with what the nexus is of what a city can require a project to do anywhere, and making sure that that requirement is consistent with what that project is doing, but no further. It isn't necessarily analysis of every possible outcome of what the project is, but really just the most likely turn of events of what could be done. It's not supposed to be the worst case scenario, but the likely impacts of what that project is. And it also isn't a decision maker. It's purely just a tool that decision makers need to use consistent with state law to help inform and guide their decision, and making sure that as they make a decision one way, either for or against any type of project, they've at least understood what the environmental ramifications are of that decision with it. So again, it's just really to help understand what those implications are. So I'll kind of cover this. So the environmental review for this project is based off an environmental impact report. There are a number of different types of EIRs, but they all follow the same format, which is what this EIR that's been made available covers. You have kind of the start of it is a project description, kind of covering what is the plan doing, what is kind of proposed with it, what actions are going to happen, and what kind of key details inform kind of what the environmental impacts could be with a project. Then there is kind of a discussion of the environmental impacts with the project and analysis of what those impacts are pursuant to state law that need to be assessed, and what are the impacts of the project with respect to those different criteria. So there's a number of different topics that I'll kind of cover, but it really is looking at what those areas are and saying, okay, what does the project do for this? What are potential alternatives to the project? What are mitigation measures? So if a project does have environmental impact, what could the project do to reduce that impact kind of below an area of threshold? And then certainly discussion of kind of the cumulative impacts as well. Now, the EIR process is considered as the gold standard of environmental review. It's the most robust version of environmental review pursuant to state law through that process. And so it is, certainly the city, as we embarked on this process, wanted to make sure that we disclose those impacts, we assess them, and making sure that as this goes to decision makers, they have a good idea of what those impacts are and can use that to certainly help inform their overall decision-making process. And then as part of the EIR process, there's kind of a few different public review periods. One is a 30-day notice of preparation that did occur in 2022, I believe. And then right now we are in the 45-day draft document. And so those that read the document can provide comment, and then that will be added into the record for the overall final EIR. And so right now the EIR is considered draft until it's certified. So members of the public get to review the draft EIR, provide comment, and then as all those get combined, those comments, that record gets built up. And then once it's ultimately decided upon, then that's when it becomes a final EIR. And then certainly, as part of the environmental review, it follows what's known as Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines. And so these are all the topics that get kind of assessed in a variety of environmental documents, but certainly the EIR as well, ranging from ag resources, air quality, to wildfire utilities, land use planning, water quality. And then with it, there is a variety of different questions in it. So you have all these different topics here, and then you have a series of questions that need to be answered within those topics. So certainly a pretty lengthy document. I've read it a few different times as trying to get it prepped. If you like to fall asleep, sometimes EIRs are really good at doing that because it is a lot of kind of technical elements. It isn't a rosy picture. It isn't a narrative. It's just purely just analysis. And so it can be a little fact heavy, but that is what the purpose is. And then the technical reports really elaborate and provide additional detail to help answer these questions with it. Now, the wine country specific plan is based off a supplemental EIR. The City of Yucaipa had done a master or programmatic EIR in 2016 as part of our general plan. And so assessed the development of the area under RL1 with that. And then there was also a second EIR that was done kind of concurrently with that, which was for the Casablanca subdivision, the one that's adjacent to Jefferson and Oakland Road that was shown previously. And so really this EIR is taking the analysis of what were those projects going to do to the environment, and what does changing the layout of the land. So the number of houses don't change with it. We're not adding houses, but we can't subtract it. But astronauts stay the same, but we're adding in this new industry to it. What happens as a result of that? And how does that impact what was the prior environmental impacts that were already planned for, and kind of leveraging that. So right now we are in the public review period. It started on December 8th, and we'll go through I think January 22nd. And then the resources are on the city's website on the city's at City Hall as well. We do have a hard copy available. To help support that EIR, a number of technical studies, including those for air quality, bioresources, aquatic resources, so jurisdictional delineation for kind of creeks and tributaries and other stuff that go into that. Cultural resources, paleontological resources, so infrastructure report, public utility service letters, traffic impact, there was tribal consultation, water demand, supply, and then also a fire protection plan leveraged on it as part of the review. And so what are some of the key takeaways in the draft environmental review? So one is that the air quality and greenhouse gas impacts are going to remain significant and unavoidable. These were listed as significant and unavoidable as part of the general plan update in 2016, and certainly if you're doing anything more development-wise, whatever that may be, it's not going to lessen the impact. And so that is a consequence of that. However, the remaining topics that I reference are less than significant. So the biological resources, for example, are improved from what is already existing because that land ends up becoming protected. It becomes zoned as open space. It's no longer in someone's backyard. The agricultural impacts are enhanced because not only do we have a small area of prime ag land with kind of surrounding the Casa Blanca Ranch with olive grove, but we're actually creating new ag land as a result, and so that provides new opportunity for prime ag land to be developed in the area, whereas most cities and most areas of the state are fighting to protect it to the extent that they can, and this would actually create it, which is very unusual with that. And then certainly the wildfire risks are kind of beneficial with it. And so one is the plan development improves the water infrastructure, so the firefighting capability for firefighters to connect to water infrastructure gets improved. The vineyards are irrigated crops, and so that provides a fuel break from dry brush. And then certainly as you have the vineyards and houses, then you also create these different fuel breaks in planted areas. And so there's actually analysis and models that go into, the wind capability, the land, the terrain, what the brush is, and what's being developed, and it actually gets improved through the development of the plan. And then certainly leveraging new building codes as well, that's required. And then as part of it is also that the water itself is adequate to support the plan. Yucaipa Valley Water District and kind of the sub-regional basin area does have water capacity. A number of past infrastructure projects that the city and the water district have done have improved the groundwater recharge, have done a lot to help add resiliency to the community. And then one of the things that is unique as well, based on kind of the condition of the Yucaipa Valley Water District's recycled water, is that the vines would be connected to the recycled water system. So they wouldn't actually use potable water. It would go into essentially reusing and kind of using that reclaimed water instead. And then that's one of the kind of benefits and how that plan has worked or is intended to be designed based on the specific plan. Now, kind of what are the next steps? So we're here tonight really to give information, a little bit more background of the why of the plan, kind of where it came from, and give a little bit more information and kind of the snapshot of how we got to where we are. There was a lot of discussion with a lot of different people to get us there. It wasn't always easy discussions, but really this was the input of a lot of different people. No single person has their mark on it, but really just a lot of different perspectives that created the overall approach. And really to get kind of, as we're now in the SEIR process, is that as you review that, if you have comments on the analysis or want clarification, those will get addressed. We will have one additional town hall as well to gather additional feedback before this ultimately gets prepared for the decision-making process. And the way that the decision-making process goes with this type of plan is the city's planning commission has to review it, and then they'll make a recommendation to the city council of, yay, we like it, or no, we don't, or we like it, but there's these other changes that maybe we need to do first into it that would better meet kind of the needs, and then we'll support it, or whatever the case may be in between, and then ultimately goes to city council for the final decision. And so that really concludes my presentation for tonight, and then we'll kind of open it up for questions.
All right, thank you, Ben. So as you can tell, this process has been lengthy and involved. A lot of people have given of their time and efforts, both in terms of city staff and elected officials and members of the community. I want to make a point that the city's role here is to respond to the community, to present a plan as an option to the community, to receive feedback, and ultimately to send the proposed plan to the decision makers. At this point, the city is not in favor or opposed to the plan. I think it's safe to say that the councils up to this point that have reviewed this have thought there was enough merit in the concept to move the concept forward at the various stages. As Ben pointed out, multiple times. This concept has come to the city council, and every time they have voted unanimously to continue with the process and to expend significant funds to research it. But ultimately, the final decision on whether or not to move forward with this will be made by the current city council in 2 or 3 months' time from now. We're gonna take public comment here. I would ask us all to remember what the purpose of tonight's meeting is, which is to gather information and to start understanding exactly what it is that is being proposed. There will be other opportunities as we get closer to the decisions that are going to be made to express opinions. I like this, I don't like it. What would be more helpful tonight is questions that help everyone understand what is being proposed. If you have reviewed the EIR, if you have specific comments of things that you'd like to see addressed within the EIR process, that is something that would be helpful as well. We are going to have a hard stop tonight at 8 o'clock. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you have a comment, please feel free to come up to this microphone here and make your comment. Please keep your comments brief so that everyone has a chance to ask a question. Please be respectful. And with that, we will begin. So if you have a question or a comment, please come on right up to the microphone. Thank you.
I was really interested in what you were talking about with ADUs. And my understanding is the state has really, in order to address the housing crisis, really made it easy for anybody to build one.
Yep.
Either an ADU or a JADU. And my understanding is you can put on any size lot, including a 10,000 square foot lot. So my question is whether and how the EIR addresses that we could be talking about, instead of 1,000 homes, we could be talking about 2,000 or even 3,000 in terms of the impacts of traffic and household water usage. Like what should we be looking for in the document to kind of get a grasp of what this could ultimately mean for us, not just what it looks like on paper now.
So part of it, as I mentioned, is the SER is kind of comparing the existing plan and kind of what this does. And so the reality is that the impacts for the number of houses and the ability for someone to build an ADU isn't actually changing just because they're already allowed to do it. If anything, with the lot sizes, so if you have a large piece of land, you're able to meet kind of the 60-40 split for an SB9 split. With the smaller lots, you're not going to have as much opportunity for doing that, and so the net outcome of what someone could do through that process would be much more constrained. But ultimately, the impacts are going to be the same just because that provision is going to exist one way or another with it.
How many questions do I get to ask? You brought up a lot of things that I need clarity. The first thing is, where do I find the EIR? Did you say I could get a hard copy if I come by City Hall?
A hard copy is available at City Hall for reviewing. It's going to stay at City Hall just because there is a cost for the reproduction of that.
So where would I look for it online then?
Yeah, so the easiest spot will be city or yucaipa.org/ and you can go to the planning page and then environmental review. So I think it's /environmental-review, but it's under the city's City of Yucaipa page. If you go under planning, you'll see a link for environmental review, and then it'll take you to where that document is.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time sleeping, so I need that report to review in detail. And stop me and send me away and have somebody else talk when you're ready, because I could go on forever. You brought up so many things. The first thing is, I'd like to know whether there's any internal bias in producing the report and having the committee. So the people who presented the report, do any of them have any ties to the wine industry, as far as you know?
The people who presented?
Who created this report currently?
No one that has financial ties to the wine.
But any ties at all?
My parents do have, or one of those amateur winemakers. I don't have any financial gain whatsoever with
Well,
that.
say you would understand the wine industry better. without games?
I have that, kind of the repercussion of me being here and kind of the person that's able to do the project as it was there. But I don't have, any
Well, good.
benefits with
I'm
it,
glad.
so, yeah.
The second question on possible bias. Normally, at-large members are people you select to be devoid of any association with some gain, wine, real estate, whatever. The three at-large members, what were their backgrounds
So they kind of ranged, one.
specifically? Go
So,
ahead.
yeah, so in the phase one, Jillian had a background. I think she did stuff with agriculture. One of them was Tony Matlock. He did have the Wildwood Oak Winery, and then I'm trying to remember the last one. Oh, Ben Masafari that had the Uptown Wine Merchant
Okay.
there, and then phase two was Tony Matlock again, Cesar Roldan that has Vines of the Valley, and then Denise Ward.
So they were people that might give you additional information, but not totally unbiased. Because the at-large, again, you want, because your committee had a lot of people that dealt with both wine and with real estate, but we'll go on, that's not that. As far as the wine is concerned, the production of current wines from the wineries we have, do you know what percentage of the wine is made from grapes from Yucaipa, and what percentage is gotten elsewhere, and are there any Yucaipa wines that are, say, 90% Yucaipa wines and so on?
So most of them, because of the grapes that are planted, are transitioning. So Norcork Winery, Vineyard and Vines, a lot of their wines are now at the age of maturity where they're actually now starting to produce with them. I think they've released at least one vintage with it, but I'm not as familiar. But I do know that they've transitioned a lot more, and other kind of local ones are doing that as well. So Herman York, I know, gets a lot of stuff. They have a few different stuff planted locally, but they do import quite a bit. But really, it takes time to grow the grapes, and so as that maturity happens and the vines reach an age at least 3 years or more, depending on the varietal, to get to that maturity, then that's when they are able to start capturing that.
So any of the wines that we have that have Yucaipa grapes in it, have any of them got rated?
I don't know for sure, but I believe.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So
Dr. Wong?
I'll leave.
If we could do maybe one more, and then
No, it's okay.
feel free to come back after everyone else has had a
Yeah.
chance to.
I'll read through the entire CEQA, and I'll bring questions next time.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I attended some of the AVA meetings, and one of the things that I was really troubled by was the number of developers that were there and the wine people. But more importantly, I was troubled by how quickly the one open spaces person was shut down every meeting that I attended. So I'm wondering how much input they really had into that report. But more importantly, that goes to bias. When it goes before the Planning Commission and that goes to your presentation to them, you are presenting it as this great, good thing. And you act like single acre homes are a bad thing, somehow a blight on the community, which is what our community is based on. So I'm wondering about the bias again in the whole project. And I'm wondering where I thought there were going to be some pictures that showed what it looked like now what it was going to look like when it was finished, and I don't see those. That's what Mayor Beaver said that we were going to get to see. That's what I'm concerned about. Did they not get made, or are they going to come at some point in the future? I know there's more than one of these meetings. Mr. Mann?
So if I may answer, I guess, a few different components. One is that the engineering, the track maps of what would be built and drawing those out. I mean, there's professional engineers that have to do that work. City staff doesn't have the time or resources to map out.
But they were going to be done, I thought.
Okay,
I'm sorry I interrupted you, forgive me.
Yeah, so I'll cover all the different points and then we can kind of go from there,
Okay.
but we don't have the staff resources to do the engineering work for private developers on an entire specific land area. And specific lands themselves are in general, in a high level, providing the framework, and then as those property owners move forward, then they have to do that laid work for it. The city doesn't do tentative maps for anyone.
Oh, I thought
so-
you had it done already.
No,
My mistake.
Yeah. So kind of covering from that. Two is all the different community members that participated did have an opportunity to weigh their things. I think the member you're referring to was actually the chair of the Phase 2 project. And so people did weigh on it. As I noted, it isn't necessarily everyone had the outcome that they wanted, and so that's certainly a challenge. And then certainly I would say in terms of kind of perspective and the bias, one of the big complaints that the wine lines had was that there was not enough movement for their vines. So no one got, I think, maybe what their outcome would have been ideally with it. And at no point did I say that 1 acre lots was a blight to the community either. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm looking at this about thing, and it says there's 1,094 acres covered, 460 for agricultural. What are the other 549?
So for the land area, it's split up with three kind of different uses. One is open space, one is vineyards, and then the remainder being housing. So a reference, the 50-50 split, is that the layout is that no more, that more than half of the site cannot be developed as housing.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. This reminds me a lot of the Serrano Estates project in a much bigger scale. And as we know, at the Planning Commission, the night that they approved the Serrano Estates project, there was quite an uprising and a lot of people speaking. There was some that were for, and there was a ton that were against. And based on that information, they green-lighted it anyway. And I really appreciate you having these town hall. And the next one I would like to see with a little bit more advertising, maybe in the News Mirror or on an electronic sign, so we can get the people to come in. But what I want to state is that at looking at this, and I've studied all the phases that were available on the website, on your website, that people understand that the villas, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to use roundabout numbers rather than the true factual numbers. There's over 600 villas in that there, correct? So those villas are 4.3 or 4.4 dwellings per 1 acre. So those are stacked on top of each other. The reason I asked that question is because that doesn't seem very rural to me. And secondly, you said that the kids will be, or the residential streets will be separated from Jefferson, because Jefferson is going to be, if I understand it right, your tasting rooms, different, maybe some food, eateries, things like that along Jefferson, that will also have a roundabout at Oak Glen Road that will connect to Jefferson pretty much through the Casablanca project. Is that correct? or the Casablanca property?
So the Casablanca or the alignment of Jefferson is going to follow actually the same design that's already approved for the 19927 or whatever project was, the Wilson Creek Estates. So that alignment of what the road should be for Jefferson, that location is going to remain the same. The city has been working on a project for kind of the Pendleton Road, the low water crossing project, and so there'll be a realignment. And so the idea for both of those was that they would connect anyways, and so that layout doesn't change either way.
I guess what I'm asking about as far as the high-density residents of the villas, you know there's going to be kids in there. How are you going to keep the kids riding their bikes safe within that region, or people walking their dogs or what have you, when you have proposed, I think, 26 micro wineries, and a micro winery is on 2.5 acres. So you said 75% of that 2.5 has to be grape growing or agricultural property. You take 2.5, you put a building, you put a parking, you put a maintenance shed and a bathroom. That doesn't leave much room for a successful winery. So I'm curious on the micros, do they come down, like you said, from Napa or Paso Robles, and these guys are marketing here and just making it a pretty garden for people to come and wine taste? Is that the plan?
No, so I think we're conflating a few different elements. So in Napa, they do have larger wine things, and there is a trend in Napa region itself, in the AVA, to allow more flexibility with the county of Napa for allowing some of the smaller stuff. So they have older standards where they have some pretty large stuff. Napa's a very large wine region, and so that market has been crowding out, and so as that free enterprises occur, they're saying, hey, some of the smaller stuff are kind of squeezed out, and so there's a trend happening kind of as part of wine industry related to that. Now, the 75% or the 2.5 acres that has to be there. So if you have 2.5 acres, you have your winery 75%, you don't have a lot of space to have a big enterprise thing, and so it really is going to be a very small scale, very intimate type of setting for that. You're not going to be able to have a big, large function because it's not meant to be designed that way.
Okay. Just a couple more things.
And then one thing I did want to note is that the meeting tonight was advertised in the News Mirror as well.
Okay. The other thing is, when talking about these projects, and Mr. Mann said this earlier, this is a big, big deal. And it really, really is, because it'll impact Oak Glen, it'll impact our traffic on Oak Glen Road. I've lived in my residence for 32 years. I know what traffic's like during apple season. We're gonna stick a whole bunch of people in there driving these vehicles coming into our territory, much like what's happening at the pumpkin patch during the holidays. It's insane. It's very difficult to navigate through. So it's a safety factor on one fact. But the other thing is, Mayor Bieber, I appreciate you being here. We had a Serrano Estates town hall with Mr. Mann, and I don't believe there was any representation from our city council. And we're here today talking about this project, which is in two districts, Mr. Beavers and Mr. Garner's. Mr. Garner has been absent. He needs to participate in this project. It's in his backyard, in his district, and we need to know what his thoughts are regarding this project. So with that, thank you for your time.
Hello, my name is David Duran. I live on Panorama above Pendleton. I have one correction to make, if I could, in your presentation. I attend Yucaipa Valley Water District meetings. That's part of my routine, and I've learned that the development of the North Benches can be broken up into essentially three elements for their water. As you know, dual plumbing, right? Where you're going to have recycled water for irrigation of lawns, and regular water, if I could call it that, for household use. But the third source of water is going to be called irrigation water. And that's going to come from historical sources out of Oak Glen. Confirmed it again with Joe Zoba today, and he and I had a meeting last week about that. So that water is not recycled water that is being produced out of the Wacoals plants out in Calamasa. That is a different water. Excuse me. I was at the VA today, yesterday, got shot, flu shot, the other shot, and then I had a root canal, so I'm really kind of out of it.
I'm glad you're here with us.
I'm glad to be here. I'm an old guy. But anyway, so there's going to actually, it's a third source of water, and it's coming from Oak Glen, from which the water has come for 50 years to be served to the entire community. Now that water is going to be plugged into the vineyards. Okay, I just wanted to make a correction on that. And if you have an update on that, that corrects me, I'd like to hear it. But that's what I know from my experience with the Yucaipa Valley Water District. Regarding the size of the vineyards, you have what is this?
Artisan and boutique.
Artisan and boutique. I made a presentation to the city council. I can't remember how long ago it was, but it was when only Bobby Duncan, who exists today on the board, was there. It was a different board. And I made a presentation based on information from UC Davis, which you know is the top ag school, and no other vinicultural school, tops that. It is really the best. 2.5 acre vineyards will not make it. They will die because the costs of labor, insecticides, everything that goes into making it is more or equal to the amount of money they're going to get per ton of grapes. At that time, the city manager was a different city manager, and he had been presented a figure of $40,000 per ton, somewhere in that area. And I did my research, and I found out that it's really not that. That what they're being paid currently for Cabernet grapes, Chardonnay, is around $700 a ton, which is a great difference. And if you look at, again, Davis studies figures anywhere from 3 to 4 tons per acre. On 2.5 acres is going to provide around $5,000, a little over five, I think it's 5.8 of income, versus $5,500 to produce those grapes. So the second question comes up: are they going to be satisfied, whoever it is, with $300? And the second is for me is labor costs. As you know, the California has now set standards for labor, and it's going to cost around $25 plus benefits per hour per person. And not only that, but you've got the state, some states, some things here that California produces just drive me nuts. But on the labor law, they are stringent on 8 hours. Anything over that is time and a half. So you are looking at labor costs that are going to just drive the cost of producing grapes. And again, this is all UC Davis studies. You cannot make it. And the second point on that is, what happens if these little 2.5 acre plots go belly up? Who's going to take care of all that? Is there a cooperative that will then take care of the blighted area? And if I could just ask one question. The people who own that 545 acres, which is diminutive, is nothing compared to what the Temecula, Napa, you're familiar with all those other areas, as to what they produce. Is that really viable? 545 acres. Is that really viable enough to create what this AVA situation? And I just want to know if that indeed is going to be economically feasible to make grapes grow on such overall size of area and 2.5 acre plots. Thank you.
So kind of, I guess, to answer the question in kind of a multi-part, since it was a few different pieces, some of it is ultimately driven by free enterprise. One, agriculture is a dynamic industry, and the reality is any small business is a dynamic industry from there. I don't know if the numbers you were quoting were just for the price per ton to sell at retail, or if it was with the cost of actually creating a sellable product and then actually selling bottles from there, because that is a pretty big disparity. But certainly it does change quite a bit as well. The market and grapes, or any ad product changes based on what the free market is doing. I've had experience with dealing with the City of Redlands orange groves, and certainly that is its own separate kind of industry too. And so it does fluctuate quite a bit.
I have 4 statements I want to make. First of all, the definition of rural to me, and the definition of rural that I understand, is that a person who owns a rurally zoned lot could keep a large animal on that lot, such as a cow, horse, sheep, whatever. I understand that in Yucaipa, you have to have at least a half an acre to have 2 large animals. 1 acre, you can have 4 large animals. That's my understanding from the rules in Yucaipa. So the problem that I find is that unless all of these are going to be at least half an acre, the people could not decide to have a horse or a cow or chickens or whatever, rural type atmosphere animal that they wanted on their property. So I think that that's a very important part of this, a hugely important part of the size of each lot. Second thing is, in a private property, 1 acre lot, I have 1 acre, and my property line is pretty much surrounded by gates and fences. So I know who's in and out of my property. I also get to decide what happens on my property. If this is developed in 1 acre lots, it prevents the further development of another 1,000 homes being developed later. And I know that you said there will be conservation easement, but I don't know how strongly that is going to be held. The third thing that I wanted to say is this is a completely sickening thing that has happened in our area, that there's been a quarantine because of a fruit fly or something. My house is in the area of the quarantine, most of Redlands, so most of Redlands and Yucaipa on the north bench is under quarantine, which means we can't bring our fruit out of that area. Do you know what that has done to Jacinos, Soffels, Farquhars, Buies, and their farmland and their ability to sell their crops? Do you know what that's going to do with developers just chomping at the bit for all that beautiful land that they have kept in orange groves and avocados? Can you imagine what's happening at this time? And how long is the county going to keep them under quarantine? And what is the truth of that, right? So this is ag. We hope that it would be kept under agricultural zoning with the vineyards, but what's the truth and who has control? In a 1 acre lot, the owner has control of that land. The last but not least thing that I wanted to say is there's at least 2 houses in my extended neighborhood who have added vineyards to their property. I purchased my property 30 years ago, built my house, have landscaped it myself. If I built my house now, I would very much consider allowing the vintners to come in and plant. It would be a lot easier for me if they did, and if they went through and wanted to collect the grapes and take care of them, I'm happy to water them if that's agricultural water or whatever, and I get a break on the water for that. That could be a 2-way street. But, and it is my understanding that I don't know the amount of your property that has to be planted in grapes, but your property is then ag exempted from property taxes for 2 years. If it's trees or a grove, it's ag exempt for 3 years. So there's what is the word, incentive for property owners to do that. So those are all pluses and minuses about this and other options we would have.
Good evening. So I'm wondering if this community would cause the property taxes of us existing folks that have been here to have any kind of additional special assessments added to our existing taxes based on this community.
No, surrounding development doesn't impact the property tax assessment for existing development. So the property taxes that you have pursuant to Prop 13, once you purchase a property, they're set there. To add a special assessment, if it were to include existing properties, requires a vote of those property owners too. And so that isn't something that's contemplated with this. Again, and going from there, the development of the adjoining properties doesn't impact the tax rate for the existing properties for it.
Thank you.
When the study committee was first, when we first began this process, I believe there was a grant, is that correct, to pay for the feasibility of developing a wine? Was there a grant for that?
So the Phase 2 project was funded through a grant from the Department of Conservation with the state. It's the Sustainable Ag Lands Community Grant or something like that. SALT is the acronym.
And it was how much?
$250,000.
250, that's what I thought. So what I'm curious about now is that we are so, as a city, invested. I want to know how much that the city has spent in order to, and I know Mr. Mann said that the city is not invested in this one way or the other, but the fact is that this looks like you're their cheerleader for this whole idea, and I understand that's the way it began, but I want to know, and I think the citizens should know, how much money we've already spent on this project.
So I can kind of cover that. So the Phase 1 project was born out of the general fund for the staff resources and the Phase 1 contract that was done. And so I think the contract was for about $75,000 or $78,000 for that, plus staff costs to do the meetings.
How much has Playworks been paid?
And then the other component is the environmental review. So that is covered. There is a fair share agreement that any development that comes through will have to reimburse it, but it was Placeworks did the EIR, and then DUDAT did the fire protection plan and the biological surveys.
And how much?
I think that one.
It's over $1 million, right?
It's not over $1 million.
It's not?
No.
How much is it?
I think it's 700 or close thereabouts.
$700,000 that we have put out for this so far.
That is right.
Okay.
I'd like to comment on that. So, as I mentioned, this has been a multi-year project. I think some of you in the room are keenly aware of the fact that I started here in Yucaipa in March of this year. I think it's safe to say that my predecessor in this position was a staunch advocate of this concept, right? There's really not much doubt in that. But as every potential phase came forward, it was brought to the city council, and the the city councils over 3 separate city councils made those decisions of whether or not to move forward with the next phase, which, you know, they also had to approve the funding for those phases. So yes, a significant amount of time, a significant amount of money has been spent to this point. However, I want to be clear that my direction to staff is that we are to present this project in a neutral manner, that the ultimate decision whether or not to make this change will be made by the current city council, and that we are not to formulate an opinion until all of the feedback has been received, all of the information is known, we have got a good sense of overall community sentiment, and then the decision makers make the decision. So it's a valid point that a lot of money has been spent, a lot of time has been spent, but from a staff perspective, I want to be clear that the staff is not pushing on one side or the other of this issue.
First of all, thanks to the city for having this forum and this dialogue. I have just a few observations. One is, this is a very niche project that's going to affect everyone in the city because everyone here has to go out to the freeways. So my question is, like Oakland Road, is that going to be widened to 4 lanes? You already restriped recently a turn lane in it and kind of wiped out the bike lane. It's all rutted and terrible. And Bryant Street probably has to be 4 lanes all the way out to Singleton to handle all this new traffic out to the freeway. And then schools, is there infrastructure for the schools to handle this new population? And then my other comment relates to just the wine industry. I don't drink, I don't know anything about wine, but if I were to invest heavily into it, I would study it, and I know how to use Google, and I was on it today, and the wine industry seems to have kind of peaked, and there's a lot of worrisome warning signs with it because all the people with gray hair who drink wine are dying, and the millennials, they drink, but they don't drink wine, the younger generation. So my wonder, I wonder, if they don't make it, then what happens? That's kind of my big question.
Okay. So kind of in terms of the infrastructure, so Bryant Street is designed per the general plan to eventually be a 4-lane roadway. There's no plans for the full connection, but certainly you see Bryant Street in segments already designed to that, and so that is part of the general plan. The number of houses that would be going to the freeway under what is the existing zone capacity and what the wine country specific plan is doesn't change. And so,
But this is going to happen all at once. If it's just zoned like it is now, houses will trickle in slowly.
Okay, so going back again, the development of 1,000 acres doesn't happen all at once, whether or not there is a specific plan or not. It does take time. The phasing kind of estimate for this is a 20-year kind of horizon. It is not something that if council approves the project, let's say hypothetically, the next day everything's being graded. That's not how development works. That's not how, with individual property owners that would have to participate, it just doesn't work. Development doesn't work in that fashion.
But it will be exponentially faster implemented. I mean, that's just awesome.
The phasing, it takes time for development to happen. I don't have a crystal ball to know whether or not one alternative makes it happen faster or not. And that's ultimately purely speculative.
Well, nothing's happened in 25 years. So.
Could we're 5 minutes till 8, so just a reminder, we've got a hard stop at 8 o'clock. So I'd ask if you've already spoken, let's let those who haven't had a chance to ask questions, and let's please keep the questions quick at this point. Also, just so you know, staff is always available, so if you have questions, please contact the planning department after this meeting. We want to make sure everyone's questions are answered, and there will be a second follow-up meeting to this meeting before we get to planning commission and council.
Chris, there's only 4 more people to speak. Can we let them speak even if it's a hard stop at 8?
Yes, good idea. The people in line now can speak, and then that's it. Thank you.
My concern is the water, recycled water that would be for the vineyards, good. But what about the water for the homes? And let me tell you, David does his research very thoroughly. And whatever information he gave you tonight, I hope you read it and study it from UC Davis. If he says the water would be coming from Oak Glen, that certainly would be a concern for everyone. But there's just so much water here in Yucaipa and for the district. Are your plans to get more water from the State Water Project, or where?
So, and it will be kind of described in the EIR. So, I guess to the point to Mr. Duran's comment is that the wines will be irrigated through non-potable water. So it would not be drinking water that's available.
Right, I understand that.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the water supply, so the Yucaipa Valley Water District does have the water supply for potable water for the homes. In terms of how they calculate the water usage on properties, 1 acre lots generate a higher water consumption per capita than some of the smaller lots. And so there is a table that's included in the analysis that kind of shows what those numbers are based on what the water district uses to kind of show the water usage output and how it meets the water district's thresholds.
Good evening. I apologize for my Christmas story opening there earlier, but I did want to get a clarification on the lot sizes, especially the 2.5 acres. We've got them separated in 3 categories. That doesn't mean that we have X amount of 2.5, X amount of the other sizes. That just is basically clarifying what you can do if you get something as small as 2.5. That's the bottom line. Is that correct?
That is correct. So certainly someone that wants to do something, they, can have larger stuff. So for the EIR, we have to kind of pick a number of what a, likely scenario is of the different number. And so that's where that number comes from. And then as part of the specific plan, there's a kind of 5-year kind of evaluation. If we start seeing stuff where the market's going a different way, we can kind of tailor from there. It isn't set in stone and then, set it, let it and set it and then forget about it. It is to make sure that it kind of reflects on it. And then certainly the acre sizes for the wineries were kind of through the consensus approach of the planning committee. City council could also decide, hey, rather than 2.5, 5, and 10, we want 5, 10, 15. And that could certainly be within the scope of that decision-making process too. But certainly that was where the committee, as a consensus, not necessarily unanimous, was at the thresholds that are shown in the specific plan as it's currently drafted.
So basically what I'm wanted to get clarified is that there might not be any 2.5 acre wineries growing there. It could be any one of those 3 sizes. But at that point of time, when you buy that amount of acreage, those are the stipulations you have to basically abide by to become a winery here.
Yeah, so it would be the minimum sizes, and I'll kind of say kind of my general thought. So I have 2 young kids, one that's almost 2 and one that's almost 5. Everyone kind of knows the story of Goldilocks. The one in the middle is kind of the Goldilocks one, and probably based on how the uses are set up, that's probably going to be the one that's the most feasible, just because of where that threshold is. But That's because I got young kids, and so I have to read that story quite a bit. So.
There you go. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Ben, thank you for presenting this evening. My apologies for coming late, so I may have missed some of the details that you were talking about earlier, and so excuse me for potentially missing some of the details. I'm a simple man, Ben. I think I've asked you this question up at City Hall, but it seems to me as we're looking at this, it's the same conversation that has happened before, in that there is changes happening to the general plan that majority of people here, majority of people who have come out to Planning Commission, majority of people who have come out for City Council have expressed their desire to not go in an opposite direction of what the general plan is saying. And so my question would be, what is the city doing to try and incorporate what the citizens that are most impacted by this area, what is the city doing to listen to their voice? What is the city doing to try and incorporate what their thoughts are? Again, I know a lot of people who are not here. I had a tough time coming here. I have 5 young kids. It is very difficult. I wish we could get paid for the amount of time that we spend coming here to talk about these issues. And it is very difficult for a lot of people to come out, but there is a lot of people who are against this and would love to negotiate and figure out maybe a common ground. But it sounds like there's wineries or wine businesses, there's developers who are the majority of people who are making these decisions, but not incorporating the citizens who are most impacted by this. And why is that happening? Why are the citizens not being, and if I could just finish with this, I moved to Yucaipa because Yucaipa still has Americana to it. It still has, the voice of the people are heard. And I think there's a beauty about that in the city of Yucaipa. I came from Los Angeles, where I grew up, eventually Loma Linda, and now out here in Yucaipa. Please, Mayor, from the whole city, listen to the people. Incorporate what the people are saying.
Yeah, so, So I think that kind of perspective is important, and a lot of the outreach we did was to try to figure out what does the community want to see, and certainly it's not a unanimous. There isn't one voice that speaks for everything, and then ultimately City Council is going to take that into consideration. I will say from seeing other projects, so when we talked about what is allowed in the general plan, the R01 district, when those projects came through. I have, the project files. I remember when the Casablanca went through, people weren't in support of that project. And so even though it met the requirements, when it was approved by the city council, it was a very kind of somber affair because it really didn't do what the community wanted other than the idea that it was just 1 acre lots. And so if we go beyond that just idea, the other features that at least was relayed and tried to be incorporated to the extent we could in the plan was other features that the community did find valuable. For whether or not it is the perfect plan, that is ultimately for members of the community and ultimately the decision makers to do. But we did try to listen to the different perspectives and go, okay, if this does get built out, what does the community want to see? And certainly with state law, if we just say, well, we don't want this or this is the only thing, we don't want to see this, we don't want to see this, but we're just going to have this in place. The reality is the city doesn't have quite that leverage, and so where we can say, if we're going to say yes, it's only going to be if you do this, this, and this for a developer, then at least we have the ability to say that and a developer can meet you there. But if it's just like, hey, this is the only rules you got and we'll take nothing less, that may be what the outcome is. But when those projects went through, it wasn't like the room was a standing ovation in support of that project approval.
Was there an answer to that question?
Well, I guess going through the history, when those 1 acre projects were approved, the community did not want that project.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say they weren't in favor of having something developed. We just want it done the right way in accordance with the general plan. But I have a few questions, and I'll try to get through these as quickly as possible. I'm looking at this figure, and it looks a lot different than the figures you presented with regard to the EIR. It looked like the EIR is only addressing the property bounded by El Dorado Park, Carter, Jefferson, and Oak Glen Road. And now we see north of Carter and also to the west of Jefferson that there are other properties that are now being considered. So in your figures that you showed previously, does the EIR cover all of this land that's up here? Because I think this is closer to about 1,200 acres, isn't it?
No, this is the 1,094 acres, and this is
Okay.
what's in the EIR.
So
Yep.
the figure that you were showing before that just showed the little block of land bounded by Carter, Jefferson, and Oak Glen.
That was a snapshot, so we had the comparison. So we overlaid, there's 3 different maps that were done. So the Casablanca subdivision, the Laird, which is north of it, and then the Coyman property to that. We took that map, kind of laid it out, and then kind of drew in the lines so that it was clear to see what that map was, and then using that to kind of show this is what the development looks like around that. And that's the couple hundred acres, but it's not the full area.
Okay.
Yep.
You'd also mentioned surveys, that there had been surveys of the citizens in this area. How many people were surveyed that actually responded positively about, I don't even think it was about this project. I think the survey was just about asking if people would support growing grapes, which is an entirely different question. But how many people responded to the survey?
I want to say it was a couple hundred participants for those surveys. And it wasn't just, do you support grapes? It was a little bit more question. The questions were submitted for review by the plan committee, so they're the ones that directed that survey question, and then took the results from there, from that, but yes.
And I think the number was about 167. And I think also that they couldn't confirm whether they were actually citizens of Yucaipa or not. The citizens of Yucaipa, particularly on the North Bench, collected 1,100 signatures against it, and yet 1,200, and yet we haven't seen the city address any of that at all, or even respond to the fact that 10 times as many people were against it in that survey. And so we haven't seen the city really stand up and really address the comments and the questions of the citizenry. The other thing that I really have concerns about is you talked and you mentioned, well, it's going to be the same amount of traffic because we have the same number of homes, but it doesn't account for the commercial traffic. And what it really doesn't account for is the buzzed and drunk drivers. And I know that Chris Mann, when he talked to us last March, he mentioned the fact that drunk driving arrests, DUIs, had increased in Yucaipa. I see a direct correlation between that and the number of beer gardens, wineries, and bars that we're building in Uptown as well. Now we're going to be building more wineries, and at 2.5 acres, on 500 acres, how many wineries is that potentially? And what will we limit it to? Ivy, Carter, and Fur are residential streets. And we see ingress and egress to these wineries now down residential streets. And so now we've got buzzed and drunk drivers. Those are very popular streets for cyclists, for our cross-country team for the high school. For youth, there are no sidewalks for them, and for horses and equestrian. How are we going to divert the traffic away, these buzzed and drunk drivers, out of those areas, and maybe get them off and out of those areas and to maybe a thoroughfare where we don't have that? Because I'm not sure it exists because we have residential along all of those streets. So I have a deep concern about the safety issues related to this, and certainly the amount of the additional traffic, the commercial traffic, as well as on top of that, the buzzed and drunk drivers. Is that addressed in the EIR?
The EIR does address
The drunk drivers?
So that, in terms of statistics for those that drive impaired, I don't know how EIR covers that analysis itself. Ultimately, what does happen in some of the different wine regions is people do utilize kind of the sharing stuff, or they'll have, the bus service that runs through that, and so that's usually a private enterprise activity that does happen. And able to quantify or qualify that may be a very difficult component.
But we hope that the city will take that into account and try and get that traffic away from the commercial traffic, away from the residential areas in Yucaipa.
Yeah, and so Jefferson would be the main corridor, And then certainly there could be additional signage or something like that.
Well, Jefferson to where? 'Cause Jefferson has to go out one of those streets.
Jefferson to Oakland Road.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I said I could come again,
Out of time, out of time.
and
So, just to kind of answer, the last two speakers both expressed concerns about the city listening, right? And I guess I would say we're here tonight, aren't we? A few months back, we had a community meeting much like this on a piece of property where there was an approved housing development project, the Serrano Estates project, and the city was considering changing direction there and purchasing the property. And we held a community meeting just like this, and the room was very clearly the vast majority of the opinions we heard were, it's a bad idea, don't do it. So we didn't do it. We are committed to listening to the residents of the city. Again, at the end of the day, your city council members are elected to study issues, to take all things into consideration, including public input and concerns, and the decision will be theirs. But our commitment is that, yes, we want feedback. That's why we're here. There'll be another one of these meetings. And then, of course, there'll be the Planning Commission meeting and the City Council meeting where council members will be presented with all the information. So you know also that this meeting is also kind of part of the EIR process. So any issues that are brought up during this meeting related to anything having to do with the EIR will be addressed in the EIR itself. So yes, this is very much a process where we're seeking and want public feedback, and all that will be presented to the decision makers. Speaking of decision makers, I'd like to recognize our mayor, Justin Beaver, and thank him for being here this evening. And he'd like to say just a couple words.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I think what I've heard over the last few years is what our community is thirsty for is not just a soundboard to listen, but to engage in dialogue with. It's extraordinarily difficult to do that without violating the Brown Act, for us all to be here to listen and then engage in dialogue. Certainly our contact information is available to the public. These are your elected officials. I know I've put my information out online, which makes my wife upset with all the phone calls, but so be it. I stepped into it. So if you would like to talk to me directly about it, call me, email me, reach out to me. I do try to be accessible to the citizens of Yucaipa, regardless of nonsensical district boundaries. Thank you for being here. I did hear what you said. I've heard the dialogue. I'm excited to see the next part of the EIR, which involves more input and rationale from the community, and we'll keep on working together to make Yucaipa what we all want it to be. Thanks.
All right, thank you all for being here. Again, if you have questions between now and the next meeting, feel free to reach out to the planning department, and have a fantastic evening.